Welcome, everybody. My name is Nasser Abu Rahme. I am a faculty fellow here at the Co-working Center. I just want to begin by welcoming everybody to this, our sixth and actually final event this semester in the Global Uprising series. Global Uprising, of course, some of you know, is been a year-long series that has really revolved around one central question or problematic, which is how do we rethink collective action in our present? How do we sort of grapple or think through the present itself as this time of generalized insurgency? And I think it's, as we wrap up, it's worth noting that we really began thinking about this series about a year ago. We began thinking about it in earnest as the murder of George Floyd took many of us into the streets of New York. And I think it's, as we wrap up, it's sort of worth just remembering, and we wrap up in the midst of the trial of the murder of George Floyd, a trial that many of us probably don't have a lot of faith in. I think it's worth just sort of mentioning and remembering the people who put their lives and bodies on the line in uprising and responding and contesting systemic and lethal injustice. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to put that out there. It's a kind of bittersweet moment to finish this series. It's great to have so many of you with us. It's great to see so many recurring faces, or names rather, names and faces, because this is really something we intended to do as a kind of open-ended, cumulative conversation, not a kind of typical conference, right? So I speak on behalf of the center and everyone involved, I think, in saying how much it means to us to see people coming back and engaging, every 2 weeks. And though it kind of wraps up for this semester, it's not quite over. We hope that in the fall and in the spring next year, we will somehow, pick this up. So kind of stay with us. So the event today is called Borders, Movements, Mobilities, and it is the second of a two-part installment in what we're calling the Afterlives of Uprising. And the Afterlives of Uprising was, for us, a way to begin thinking beyond uprising as this sort of discrete event, right? We wanted to think about uprising as a kind of imprint or continuum that extends beyond that sort of spectacular insurrectionary moment. And last session, we talked about disappearance and exile, and we wanted to end, I think, in somewhat of a sort of optimistic belief that it would be a better moment to end on, but we wanted to end with the question of migration, borders, mobility. In particular, we kind of asked our panelists to think about how things like movement or the displacement of people can factor into our readings of uprising, or in turn, how we can track the work of uprising in political geographies of encampment or sanctuary or bordering itself. And really whether there was a way of reading the movement of people, the migratory movement of people and its challenge to the border regime, a waning and fragmented border regime itself, not as just the kind of fallout of uprising, but itself as a kind of continuation of uprising, right? It's somehow connected to uprising. So those are the kind of provocations we threw out. They are the stakes, broadly speaking. And I'm going to turn it over in a minute to our panelists to kind of get into that. Before I say a brief word about format, I just want to plug our other year-long series. It's called Digital Forays. It's a kind of exploration into what it means to think and write and be and act in a visual world. The next event in that series is coming up on April 15th, and it's on visualization and digital storytelling. So keep an eye out for that. So in terms of format, it's going to be, as always, each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to stake an intervention. We will then turn to our discussant, who will facilitate a sort of conversation with the panelists for about another 20 to 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to general Q&A, right? And I invite you all to pitch in then or pitch in before, right? There are two ways of getting involved in the conversation. You can use the raise hand function and raise your hand during the Q&A session, or you can post a question in the chat box. And I want to emphasize that you can do that at any time. You don't have to wait to the Q&A bit to kind of do that, you can do that. We'll pick it up. We'll relay it to our panelists today. I want to also mention that this event is recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube page shortly enough. Okay, so our speakers, I'm going to give very brief, lightning quick introductions. You can read the fuller bios on our webpage. But we have today with us 4 really brilliant and I think committed activists, thinkers, publishers, and we're very grateful to have them with us. And I'm really delighted that they are the ones with us to sort of wrap this up today. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order and in the order in which they will appear. Leopold Lambert is a trained architect. He's the editor-in-chief of The Funambulist and the author of Weaponized Architecture, The Impossibility of Innocence. Naomi Paik is an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the author of last year's Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century. And our discussant is Paula Chakravarti, an associate professor at the Gallatin School and at the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, also here at NYU, and the author of Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime. So I want to thank them again for being with us today and taking the time. And I want to hand it over to Asla. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, and I'm very grateful to the Kevorkian Center and for organizing this event. And thank you so much, Nasser, for putting all this together. I wanted to start off with the contemporary dynamics. There are a few things that I wanted to do. So let's see how much of it I can fit in 10-minute presentation. But I wanted to open up with the contemporary dynamics with regard to mobility, and then bring the conversation to Turkey, and then to have this conversation in relation to the uprisings that had happened about 10 years ago in the region, and then tie it all back to today again. So when I just wanted to begin with the Turkish government's reaction to the killing of George Floyd last year. So the Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan condemned the killing of George Floyd as deplorable and racist, as a fascist act, and against the backdrop of reports of violence of the law enforcement and state security forces targeting Turkey's own undesirables, undermining their lives. He said that as a member of Turkey, like of a Muslim civilization, Islamic civilization, Turkey will be following this grave human rights violation. And disregarding what was happening in Turkey, projected an image of leadership of the so-called Islamic civilization, and as a spokesperson of undesirables, the subalterns, if you will, elsewhere. Indeed, the underlying logic of the system that undermines Black lives might not be divorced from the racist anti-immigration policies in the United States that subsequently put immigrant kids in cages, racist immigration policies, and manifestations of racialized differences and how they were managed put in place, connects in some ways how like management of difference when it comes to a systemic discrimination can be joining the engagements with difference in the face of mobility, of migration, of the flow of human beings in the middle of a big humanitarian crisis. What we have also seen is the borders, for example, becoming more and more ossified, if you will. In the case of Turkey, Turkey's borders have been so while Turkey was condemning all of this that was happening, Turkey was also simultaneously crushing, Turkish officials have been simultaneously crushing any form of dissidence, any form of basically resistance to state policies, be it environmental policies or Turkey's own management of difference, Kurdish rights, and so on and so forth. So what happened in the context of Turkey is Turkey opened its borders in the contemporary context to the flow of people who were arriving from Syria, mostly 3.5 million approximately is estimated to be in Turkey today. Meanwhile, closing its borders with Europe and therefore generating a wall of these peoples who were running away from the aftermath of the uprisings that had happened in Syria. And so what we do see is Turkey's like dirty bid with Europe, and then turning the borders with Greece and other like adjacent to European countries, turning into a wall. Meanwhile, opening the borders and to those who arrive from Syria, but there is also a big constituency of Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt, also located in Turkey. So opening its borders to insurgents of elsewhere, but crushing its insurgents or its dissidents, or people who are just fleeing for their lives elsewhere, but generating its own diaspora simultaneously. So in that regard, I wanted to go back to the uprisings that happened about 10 years ago, in the case of Turkey, 8 years ago, and revisit then and now, and to raise questions about the contemporary dynamics, where on the one hand, Turkey, that enables Turkey to promote itself as a leader of Muslims, and meanwhile generating a differential treatment of its own maybe dissidents or different claims for difference and autonomy and so on and so forth, especially in relation to contemporary border dynamics. And that's how I'm going to tie them all together. So when in Turkey, the Gezi Park protests happened in 2013. This was broadly seen as the ignited different protests that happened in the region, but also in Greece in the 15M movement, in the case of Spain, and how in the Mediterranean there was like this big movement with this big push for change. And what was happening at the time was Turkey was being shown as a model of democracy, and together with the World Economic Forum's own sponsorship of branding policies. So they brought in like London-based firms to brand countries in the Middle East under the World Economic Forum's sponsorship, bringing in business people from Goldman and Sachs, different kinds of financial institutions, Middle Eastern politicians, but also business people from there too, and leaders of financial institutions there too, to come up with an idea of branding the Middle East. This happened roughly in mid-2000s, and up until 2013, even though there was this big economic crisis of 2008, what we did see is this like this wind, let's say, of liberal facade that took into consideration of different leaders in the Middle East as like, and promoting them as you know, going against Orientalist engagements with their country's brands, and to try to bring brand justice to their differential treatment in the international images. That was like part of the issue. So as part of this, what has happened is Turkey adopted this liberal window dressing, let's say, and it was branded as a model of democracy in the Middle East. Turkey always had problems with democracy, and why the Middle East needed a model is another question. even less so a neo-Ottoman Big Brother kind of one. But what also brought forth was the idea of the happiness index of the peoples themselves. What the uprisings during the Gezi Park protests did is that it showed a disgruntled crowd, and especially for a leader like Erdogan, who actually always claimed to represent the real people. I'm trying not to use the word populism here, the real people. It really shattered that image. And I think it was very difficult for him to accept. And what came forward was big counterinsurgency tactics that actually sought to fix people in certain places, to mobilize them, and to bring what they call non-lethal technologies. Like, for example, the silent guardian of Raytheon, which microwaves your skin, for example. And if used carefully, it may not leave any trace on your skin. We do not know if the Turkish government bought it, but we do know that they did a presentation, Raytheon, in Turkey, to sell this crowd control tool. Because there is no transparency, we really do not know much. But what we do know is the counterinsurgency techniques, the crowd control techniques, they became the word of the time. And it was what also we have seen is from the military coup eras, where the military was the guardian of the capitalism, it was now passing on to the riot police to be the guardians of capitalism in the case of Turkey. Elsewhere too, there were uprisings, and meanwhile, Erdogan, prime minister at the time, he did open the borders of Turkey and did meddle with like policies of Syria, etc. Opened its borders, and it became more fluid, but including the certain Salafi fighters as well, and then deployed them as mercenaries elsewhere. And in the middle of this big humanitarian crisis, which also followed the economic crisis of 2008, where in the European Union itself, we did see similar to what was happening here in the United States in the beginning, that I gestured to in the beginning of my talk. There was this idea of the foreigners are going to come and we will be disappearing under the flood tide of Muslim immigrants. In a way that is reminiscent of the earlier era. That was my own work from the book as well. The fusion of eugenicist thought with demography, as if demography is also not a very let's say transparent field. It has its own histories, and this fusion of the eugenicist thought with demography, this idea of like a demographic threats, race suicide, white extinction, all of these narratives that we see being on the rise, have all combined together, and what we do see is these policies crystallizing yet again on Turkey's borders. We see, for example, rather than asking the question in the context of maybe here in the United States or also in the European Union, what kinds of steps that were taken in the economic and political fields that did generate unemployment, for example. The question becomes, they are coming to replace us. They are going to steal our employment, the immigrant tide that is coming as part of the aftermath of the uprisings that had happened, and then that generated different turmoils in the region. And it became even worse, I think, with Turkey's and other countries' interventions there. But what we do see is these ideas of, rather than asking the question about economic and political steps and policies that were taken that led to unemployment, the question is, we have limited resources to begin with, and therefore we need to think about it in terms of protecting these resources, and racialization of the distribution of resources. So what we do see is this racialization of Islam, and what we do see in response to this is a leader like Erdogan picking up on that and promoting himself as the voice of anti-colonial, like Muslim civilization leader. Um, Whereas what he's actually really doing is it's not anti-colonial, but it's really cultural civilizationism that he's being promoting as a way of like appealing to the Muslims in Europe, but also to the Muslims elsewhere. And meanwhile, making this pact with EU to generate a literal wall, if you will, not maybe a concrete one, physical one, but turning Turkey's borders into a wall that separates Muslims, mostly Muslims, from the European continent. So in that regard, how can we rethink mobility? And also, of course, we see these another movement that is emerging as a result of this, which is a very right-wing, very civilizationist, not only in the case of Turkey with the example of Erdogan, but also a white civilizationist narrative that is happening in the case of the Europe, but also here in the United States with Identity Europa turned into American Identity Movement. So any form of thinking about mobility is also finding its counter movements in such discursive practices that different people are exercising, coming together. And meanwhile, what we also see is, again, this eugenicist thought that your biology determines who you are. And again, returning to a biologized understanding of difference, which is racialized. Which means that the immigrants are bad people, they are criminals, and turning it into also, rather than a humanitarian, a securitarian logic. And this gains a different streak with where immigration used to be a human capital discussion, but also another like different kinds of like mobilities discussions in relation to people coming in, and I mentioned this in relation to employment matters. And what you do see now is this more protectionism, more ossification of the idea of borders among certain constituents of the society. And so if we're going to be thinking about any form of afterlives of these movements, we do need to take into consideration mobility. We do need to take into consideration different movements, left and right, and inform our own projects of solidarity without losing maybe our eyes from the big picture of what else is brewing in there. And because these right-wing movements, they also echo each other, bounce off each other, and they feed off from each other. So I just wanted to say that any form of rethinking of afterlives, of uprisings, and this is not in the happy note that I know you wanted to emphasize, Nasser, but I do think that any form of solidarity does need to also always keep an eye on what else is happening on the ground, and to be prepared accordingly with counterinsurgency tactics, turning into crowd control mechanisms within the borders of the country, but also management of difference, dissidence, together with borders and mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Asla. That was great. And I know optimism is a tough brief these days, so I'm just I'm not holding anyone to that. Leopold, please.
Thank you. Okay, it's working, right? Yeah, okay, great, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful and happy to be here, in particular in company of Asli, Naomi, and Paola. Indeed, I'm also very attached to the idea of optimism, and or what I sometimes call tactical optimism, because optimism might not be winning, meaning we're winning, but somehow we still need to particularly look at the various things that are being done, however asymmetrical they might be, and uprisings are certainly a good way to talk about it. I have to admit that I had a lot of difficulties responding to the brief, the very, very interesting brief that was sent to us and that Nasser sort of synthesized. And then and then only yesterday I remember that I just spent the last 5 years writing a book that talked about 3 uprisings. So I was thinking, oh well, perhaps perhaps that makes sense. And this might answer the question. I think it's mostly about putting a few items on the table, and for us to perhaps pick some later on and talk more or something. But what those uprisings are doing indeed are very much making a dent in colonialism, a strong one. But indeed, as Asli said, also we cannot not process into this the fact that colonialism very much adapts itself and react to it, and invents new modes and transmits various techniques and strategies of counterinsurrection and counter-revolution. So the 3 uprisings that I'm talking about are, perhaps I should say that they link through one thing, which is sort of a pretext for me, that even though that the title of the book it's called it's a French book, but it's in English it would be States of Emergency, a spatial history of the French colonial continuum. And the state of emergency is indeed one of those sort of counter-revolutionary legislations that were drafted very much like the British, in Kenya or Malaya after the World War II, as a colonial counter-revolutionary strategy. So that's something that I'm looking at in the context of the Algerian Revolution from 1954 to 1962, that I'm sure many people here are quite familiar with. But also the Kanak insurrection of 1984 in 1988 in what some of us are calling, Kanak people in particular are calling Kanaki, which is the indigenous name of New Caledonia, which remains a French colony in the Pacific Ocean today in Melanesia, northeast offshore of Australia, if you want to picture it. And another example of French settler colonialism as well. Like it has a lot of similarities, and of course a whole lot of specificities as well, but a lot of similarities with the Algerian case, and that's something that I'm trying to show in the work. And then the banlieue uprising of 2005 that some of you might remember, with many of the youth that whose parents or grandparents used to be colonial subject under French Empire or other European empire. It's worth saying. And then looking at the various uprisings that happened since then, which were never as big and never as sort of coordinated at such a, I mean, not really coordinated, but happening simultaneously at such a large scale. But both before and after, there was many revolts in the banlieue, in those peripheries where the majority of people who live in are indeed part of the French colonial history. And yeah, and I'm insisting on this 2015 to 2021 moment also because of the state of emergency, but I don't think that matters so much here. But so what I'm trying to do is to represent the concept that I'd like to bring today, which is the colonial continuum, which is sort of a phrase that we hear. I wouldn't say often, but regularly within the anti-colonial activism in France, but almost always, actually pretty much always, it's akin to the concept of continuity. So it stops at at the at the conceptualization of a continuity between colonial situations and the present. But the way I wanted to talk about the colonial continuum was to think of this continuum almost in I mean, to take the sort of physics definition of continuums quite seriously, and to think in terms of space-time, and to try to represent it in a way that would be useful to sort of make sense out of it and to see what it does. So I mean, this diagram is not necessarily doing that so much, because it's a more of a it's a diagram for the cover of the book, so it's a little bit more symbolic. But what those arrows can signify can be found in a little bit more targeted and precise way here, and that very much questions the notion of mobility. There's a mobility, of course, of colonized peoples themselves, people who would, for example, go from a colonized territory to the so-called metropolis and become so-called immigrants there, which doesn't really make sense as a concept, since I mean, it's always the sort of contradiction of colonialism itself, which consider its colonies both as exogenous and endogenous. And so there's sort of many people and many beings who navigate in this colonial continuum, this sort of topological surface of space-time. And then there are some people we can very much identify who are moving, who are also navigating in this colonial continuum, who are colonial administrators, prefect, members of government, and militaries, which are sort of going from one space-time to another, and acquire certain amount of sort of strategical expertise and counter-revolutionary expertise, and in the end, the sort of endpoint is often what you have written here as quartier populaire, which is another word for banlieue. There's a slight nuance to it, but it doesn't really matter here. But so the sort of racialized working class neighborhoods of France. And so you quite literally have sort of a colonial expertise of a colonial administration expertise that is being transmitted from space-times to other this way. So that's something that I try to do. And in an even more sort of comprehensive manner, I try to also represent this space-time through an entire map of the book, which is what you see. So it's also trying to think of time a lot, because I'm, as Nasser kindly said, I'm a trained architect, so I've been quite used in thinking through the politics of space, but much less so in the politics of time, and that's something that I really had to grapple with, and trying to, in that case, to show in the way we represent space-time, to also show the compressibility and the stretchability of time, and various other dimensions of temporal politics. But also trying to show those movements, trying to show this bordering, but also trying to see how those space-time sort of can be read together in a way that makes sense, and in an argument that could be operative for today's presence activism, because that's very much the ambition of the book, more than anything else. So I can zoom a little bit. I mean, I guess you won't really see any of those. You won't be able to read any of those events, but basically, I don't know if my mouse is appearing or not, but the Algerian Revolution is here, and all those sort of red areas are like various forms of quote unquote exceptional legislation. I mean, I very much go against the notion of exceptionality in that book, but doesn't matter too much here. Here's a Kanak insurrection in Kanaki, which is like also this space that it's shown here, and the banlieue uprising over here, and then our more recent time with since 2017, the end of 2017, the state of emergency that's been turned into a common law that has another name that was never contested by pretty much anyone in the parliament, but that very much crystallized the state of emergency and its colonial legacy into common law and in the sort of construction of what we might want to call proto-fascism in France right now. I would just wanted to finish with another uprising, one that I was lucky enough to and privileged enough to witness myself, which were the Gile Noir, so this sort of new generation of undocumented activists who were following in the path of their big siblings or even parents from the 90s, yeah, I would say even parents from the 90s, and who occupied the French Pantheon, you know, this building in Paris where the quote unquote great men are buried, the great men to whom the nation is thankful. And so the Gilets Noirs occupied 600 of them occupied the Pantheon in July 12, 2019, in a sort of incredibly powerful, not just pictorially, just in that very space time, like that's because space time also, you know, can be a very sort of punctual, both in terms of space and both in terms of time, but an incredible space time of challenge to the French colonial continuum, with an extremely articulated discourse around this. The fact that many people's grandfather had been fighting for France during either the First World War or the Second World War, and that colonialism was even at the sort of neo-colonialism was very much at the one of the cause of their own displacement to France. And so yeah, so I guess that's also where I felt that the optimism was, the tactical optimism was about situating one of those space times that can really inspire us. So that's what I have for you to begin with.
Thank you, Leopold. I'm going to turn it over to Naomi.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here for another Zoom meeting. I want to thank Nasser Al-Farame for the invitation to be part of these important discussions. And I also want to say how honored I am to be in conversation with Paula, Leopold, and Asle. I also wanted to thank James Ryan, Vitandi Budram, Fidele Harfuche, Miriam Osman, and Dorsa, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm so sorry, Gilazizadeh, for arranging the back-end details, and to everyone whose invisible labor makes this gathering possible. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of the themes that Asle and Leopold have touched on. I'm going to do the typical kind of provincial American thing and focus more on the US context. So I think the questions framing our conversations encourage us to think beyond uprising as just a moment or event, which I really appreciate that framing, but just as the way things just are. And this capacious thinking about what counts as uprising helps elucidate how migration itself can be seen as part of these persistent conditions. So while the kind of framework that you sent us refers to specific instantiations like the Arab revolts or the Occupy movements, our framing questions suggest that the afterlives of uprising mark not so much an after, but an emerging structure of our historical moment, which seems to be defined by multiple crises that then mark a new kind of norm, a permanent norm. So our conveners sort of suggest and identify the era of neoliberalism as one of the structures of this open-ended crisis. And so neoliberalism is this condition for that open-ended uprising, and also connects these various manifestations in disparate sites across the globe. So I thought that this related to some arguments that Bill Mullen and Chris Viles make in their examination of the rising fascist trends emerging out of the unraveling of the post-war liberal order. So they identify a weave of epochal shifts in the era of neoliberalism, which include a rapacious turbo-capitalism, attacks on working class lives and welfare, the gutting of worker organizations, and the end of the Cold War, and the rise of the US as global hegemon, 9/11 and the war on terror, and the crisis of imperialism that forces displacement and migration. But I also want to emphasize that the kind of crisis marked by the term neoliberalism also emerges from much deeper roots that go much further back. So undergirding neoliberalism are the underlying structures of white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalist exploitation, and exclusionary notions of belonging, which are violently imposed by the nation state form itself, right? And because nation state borders enforce and also enhance imperial inequalities of wealth and power, that's their main purpose, migration today might thus be seen as a form of decolonization. So as Tandaye Achiume argues, migration enacts a rebalancing of the beneficiaries of an asymmetrical system initiated by the very same state sovereigns that now self-righteously seek the exclusion of migrants. So while we're focused on the kind of neoliberal era, if we're able to pan out a little bit more, we can see an extended framework of uprising in an even longer array of modernity itself, as well as its others. Even as we focus on more contemporary moments. So kind of drilling down and getting more specific, I wanted to focus on one of the leading questions that Nasser sent us. Is there a way of reading migratory movement and its challenge to waning border regimes, not just as the fallout, but as the continuation of uprising, not just as a perceived, but an actual threat to the established order? And so the fact that people continue to move across borders in the face of escalating regimes of militarization, policing, surveillance, and the weaponization of natural landscapes like deserts and oceans and forests kind of elucidates the guaranteed failure of border regimes, no matter how violent they get, to do what they purport to do, which is to prevent human migration. They never work. They will not work in an era of global capitalism. So migrants' continued movement also exposes the irresolvable contradiction of neoliberal capitalism. And it's this contradiction that could or might lead to some of its unraveling or its undoing. And this is the demand for the free movement of goods and capital across borders and its simultaneous lockdown on the movement of people. This seems like a pretty obvious contradiction. But I want to think about how can we pull at that contradiction in order to unravel neoliberal capitalism itself. So even if migrants, even if they're not necessarily articulating arguments for a borderless world, they are nevertheless enacting one through their movement and their presence in places where sovereign states declare that they have no right to be at all. And so in this way, I feel like they enact an idea that Ruth Wilson Gilmore has put this way. She states, if we want to think about a world after borders, then we have to live as if borders can go. Okay. So the actions of migrants align with another one of Gilmore's arguments about social movements. She's noted that often people and organizations advance abolitionist projects that seek to dismantle life annihilating institutions while building life affirming institutions without necessarily claiming it explicitly, or sometimes they're not even realizing that they're involved in something called abolition necessarily. So she notes how ordinary people are always collaborating to support each other, like in places like their workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, religious spaces, and other kind of collectivities, right? And she talks about how people work together to meet their own survival needs and to push back against austerity measures or subjection to exploitative and repressive powers, right? So in a similar way, we might think about how migrants, whether they claim to be engaged in projects of abolishing borders or not, they are nevertheless kind of moving us in that direction. So by moving across borders, by moving across what they already know our heavily police, surveilled, and militarized borders. And by risking their lives along the way, these migrants are innovating strategies of collective movement and mutual aid, and they are living as if borders can go. Right? And this obviously doesn't mean that they move through space as if borders don't exist, right? They have to take these really circuitous routes of transit migration, traveling through multiple modes of transportation across vast expanses of space to circumvent border regimes. But their movement across and their violation of those border regimes demonstrate their refusal and their obstinance and their disobedience, right, to submit to border regimes that subject them to the losing end of imperial global inequalities. And so this individual and collective refusal to abide by borders does constitute an actual and not just a perceived threat to the established order of global capitalism, right, which is regulated in part by nation states, which is why they are so violently targeted by the state. So migrants show through their movement that it is not only possible to violate, that it is not possible, sorry, okay, let me start. Migrants show through their movement that it is not possible to violate people and environments elsewhere through military violence, anti-democratic political interventions, extraction of resources that devastate natural and human ecologies, and other modes of economic imperialism like flooding markets with imports, et cetera, right? You cannot do all of this kind of violation of people elsewhere and then expect those people to just admit to the evisceration of their conditions for life, right? So by refusing the sanctity of borders and of the imperial order that those borders enforce, migrants demand that they will live, asserting that this will be a living life. And even upon finding a place where they can land and reside, the mere presence of undocumented people in places where they have no state-sanctioned right to be enacts another way of living as if borders can go. And so such undocumented persons are not waiting for permission or a pathway to citizenship or an immigration form that will never come to be in order to find a place to live, work, send their kids to schools, and build their lives, right? They're not waiting for permission. So these are not necessarily conventional ways of thinking about uprising at all. They are absolutely about agency, which Ruthie defines as the ability to craft opportunity from the wherewithal of everyday life, even if these acts aren't necessarily organized forms of collective resistance as resistance that we would conventionally understand, right? So those networks that people rely on to meet their daily needs, like living communally, pooling resources, drawing on extended family and non-kin familial relations, is a form of disobedience to the state. It's a refusal of its dictates and borders, not because migrants openly oppose or rise up against the state, but because they are finding the resources they need to live at all. So these everyday forms of living as if borders can go can and do turn into more organized forms of uprising that we would more conventionally recognize, right? When they come into direct confrontation with the state, especially state agencies of violence and social control, like the cops, ICE, CBP, detention centers, and so on, right? And it's those confrontations against the state's efforts to reinforce the meaning and power of borders that can transform everyday conditions into grounds for organizing and potentially coalesce into a social movement as conventionally understood. And so often it can be through these confrontations, like having a neighbor or a family member whisked away, right? That people come to explicitly identify the means by which they become targeted by the state and the underlying conditions that led people to migrate and live without status in the first place. So I'll just focus on one kind of one recognizable example, which is the US sanctuary movement, which I'm obviously very interested in, that emerged in the late 1980s in solidarity with Salvadoran and Guatemalan migrants fleeing the dirty wars. So as part of its Cold War anti-communist foreign policy, the US supported military governments that brutally suppressed leftist and indigenous opposition movements, as we well know, ultimately killing more than 75,000 Salvadorans and 200,000 Guatemalans. And yet we as a country refuse to recognize Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees as refugees, instead deporting them back to conditions of certain death. And migrant organizers and citizen allies violated the state and its border regimes by providing transportation, shelter, food, legal aid, and medical care, right? And by offering sanctuary and mutual aid to these migrants, they connected the root causes of migration, right? The US support of those repressive regimes to the unjust immigration policies that refuse to deal with the fallout of that support. So citizens organizers also faced criminalization of their solidarity and their condemnation as convicted felons for running a modern day underground railroad, right? Which harkens back to that prior historical era when abolitionists not only offered sanctuary to the self-emancipated, but also worked to overturn an entire political economy based on chattel slavery. And I'm wondering if we can take inspiration from that historical moment and see the current sanctuary movement as doing something more than just providing charity for unfortunate migrant others, but as a lead into thinking about how do we overturn neoliberal capitalism? How do we overturn capitalism itself, right? How can we think of sanctuary as a contestation of state subject making, as the deportable subject who refuses to be constructed as such? And this is one of Shannon Speed's arguments. So I want to look to the very presence of migrants here and their disobedience to unjust laws, whether it's at the borders or within the interior of certain nation states. And I want to think about how migrants might show us the potential to reconceive of our affiliations beyond state mandates and beyond citizenship and beyond legal status. So I'll stop there so that we can have a good conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I'm going to turn it over to Paula, who's going to facilitate a discussion. I just want to remind people that after that, in about 20 minutes, 30 to 30 minutes, we'll move to an open Q&A, but you can post questions in the chat anytime. So Paula, over to you.
Okay, thank you everyone. And thank you Nasser, James, and everyone for organizing this event, and of course to the speakers for their provocative and insightful discussions. I think I have quite a challenging role here in trying to sort of think through these three rich discussions and that address similar questions in pretty different contexts, but how can we sort of think about them together? And since it is almost 1:30, maybe what I will do is make just very brief remarks. And I'd actually like to ask you each a question or two, but I imagine you have questions for each other. So I'd like to allow us to have that kind of a time to talk with each other. So for me, what I see in both your presentations and the work of yours that I've read, Asla, your book, Naomi, your most recent book, and Leopold, your amazing magazine, and also the work that the brief of your upcoming book that you shared with me. A theme that comes up across all three of your intellectual and political commitments is a shared critique of both liberal humanism and humanitarianism, and an attempt to move beyond that kind of liberal humanism, humanitarianism towards a radical critique and intervention, whether through Leopold, your work on visualization and cartography, Asla, your work in thinking about cultural policy and practice, and Naomi, your historically grounded work on social movements. And so in thinking about the three of your projects at this particular moment, both this moment of global pandemic, in the aftermath of the George Floyd uprisings, but also in the shadow of the decade following the Arab uprisings, Occupy, Gezi Park, etc. I feel like we could think through this crisis of both racial capitalism and racial citizenship together through the works that you have shared with us. On one hand, as your work alluded to, we're at a moment of ethno-nationalism, right? Whether we think about India's Narendra Modi, Erdogan, Netanyahu, Bolsonaro, Leopold, you talked about a kind of proto-fascism in France. We are just coming out of the Trump era here in the US. So we have this kind of ethno-nationalist landscape through which we think through mobility and migration as a movement in the ways I think that Naomi's talk especially gestured towards. And I'm also interested in the kinds of questions around capitalism and thinking about neoliberalism that Naomi raised. One of the questions in relation to that has to do with how we might conceive of mobility and migration through the lens of debt and indebtedness. In some ways, can we see migration and the movement of people as a kind of ongoing response to 4 decades of a debt crisis, right, of neoliberalism and the kind of debts that are differentially accrued by places, by communities, and by people. And so in some ways, is there a way to think about reparative justice through debt and mobility? But I also feel like, at least in the US, and this is I think different than other parts of the world at this particular moment, we are also living at a point in which discussions about the role of the state in redressing capitalist inequality and in addressing questions of welfare are also in a moment of transition, potentially, also in a moment of potential opening. And so how do we think not only about the kind of violence of the state at this moment, but also, and in the ways that Naomi talked about, the policing of borders, violence, et cetera, where then you focus on the communities affected protecting themselves, and that kind of sanctuary solidarity of communities who are equally attacked. So that's one way to think about the state. But how do we potentially also think about a state that plays the state that can be pushed, and a state that might imagine a welfarism outside of a nationalist welfarism, So in that sense, is this also a moment for us to imagine and engage with more productive claims making of the communities that we're thinking about, and reimagine the role of the state and the role of the state in holding capital accountable primarily, right? I'm thinking about the unionization drive in Alabama, for example, and the kind of efforts in which racialized migrant workers, essential workers, whether, we're thinking about migrant workers in India whose, inequalities became exposed to the nation through COVID, or of course, migrant workers in this country, right, who bore the brunt in many ways of this pandemic. What kinds of accountability, kind of positive accountability, can we imagine, right? So the sort of the dual nature of the state is something that I personally am thinking about, and I wonder what you all have to say about that. I guess my other question, or the other theme that I was thinking about in listening to all of your presentations had to do with kind of trying to make sense of the kind of afterlife of movements in different ways. Of course, at this, the Kevorkian Center is asking us to think about the afterlife of the Arab uprisings, the afterlife of the George Floyd uprisings. I myself have been thinking a lot about the afterlife of the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests, which were happening in India right before the COVID lockdown, in which you had this kind of multi-ethnic and youth-led movement that was quite spontaneous, but then also had connections to different kind of social movements, student movements, union movements, et cetera, that arose and then was repressed as as the Indian government implemented one of the most extreme lockdowns in anywhere in the world in March of last year. Of course, right now in India, there's a massive farmers' protest happening, right? And you can see the kind of activism against neoliberalism that is threatening the hold of these authoritarian figures like Modi and Erdogan, et cetera, who love to wrap themselves in the flag of anti-colonial Hindu or Muslim civilizational discourse against a sort of evil global north. So I guess I don't even know if this is a question so much, but I guess I would like us to think, I would love to hear from all of you to kind of think through this kind of conjuncture we're in, which is surely one in which the ethno-nationalist kind of right is on, we see the rise, we see the power, we see the hold, but we also see other formations, right? And this is not in my way, in any way, you shouldn't be getting from me a vibe that I'm optimistic about the Biden administration. That's not my point here, but it's a moment of potential, right? For really shifting the kind of normative debates about the role of the state in holding corporate power accountable, for example, organized labor. So I guess, I'm interested in hearing from all of you to think through how the kind of spontaneous uprisings, whether the Gile Noir, Leopold, that you talked about, or the sanctuary movement, Naomi, that you've written so much about, or Aslı, the opposition movements in Turkey that you have been a part of and written about. What is that relationship between those kinds of spontaneous community-based movements and more formal, organized legacy movements and new movements, including electoral politics, right? And then secondly, I guess this kind of critique of the liberal humanist version and critique of the kind of fascist ethno-nationalist that you're both, that I think all of your work is kind of trying to hold and show some sort of lineage between. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more from each of you, how you think about that at this particular moment. And maybe I'm thinking about that in particular because in the Indian context, where you have the Hindu right in power and a kind of clamp down on media, clamp down on the judiciary, attack on liberal academics, attack on liberal media advocates is a distressing sign for the radical outside, and so in some ways, having the space to say that the critique of liberalism is connected to this kind of right-wing ethno-nationalism is almost a luxury, right? In places where it's actually even, they go after the liberals, right? And so then there is absolutely no space. And so I'm just, I'm wondering about this particular conjuncture for all of you to think through those kinds of questions. So those are my very unformed, disorganized comments, but I hope they'll generate some responses from all of you. And I encourage you to ask each other questions. So I will leave it at that. If anyone wants to go after me in response to what I raised, I would be grateful.
Does anybody want to go first, or? Naomi, do you want to say something?
Do I? Okay.
We're all like being very polite.
Okay, so that was thank you, Paula, so much for those questions. They're really deep and wide-ranging, and they kind of are the big meta questions I think we're all facing today. So I have so many things to say about some of the I feel like there's two main questions. One is about the critique of liberalism, liberal humanism, and what do we do with that critique in sites and places where there is almost no space for even a critique of liberalism, because that thing gets like kind of absorbed into kind of a right-wing ethno-nationalist project. And the other question was about what do we do with the state, right? So I don't have answers to either one of those. So I can say a few things. In terms of the critique of liberalism and fascism or ethno-nationalism, I think it is important to keep that critique of liberal humanism and liberalism overall. And I think maybe one way to think about the kind of the very predicament that you're talking about is seeing how in places in liberal democratic or purportedly liberal democratic countries or locations like the United States, like France, like India, right? That the very roots of fascism and ethno-nationalism that we see emerging from these liberal democracies, it comes out of contradictions internal to liberalism itself,
Sure.
right? So liberalism has never really been for everybody. It's only been for the select few and has been built on the exploitation, the genocide, the extermination of everyone else, right? And so I think if we're able to kind of identify the roots of fascism within liberalism itself, I wonder if that maybe can that create space for offering, like continuing to have a really stringent and persistent critique of liberalism while not allowing it to be sucked into an ethno-nationalist right-wing project, which is also absolutely what we don't want, right? And then in terms of the state, like I go back and forth about how we think about the state all the time. So like on the one hand, sometimes I'm kind of like, if I'm against the anti-state state of neoliberalism, sometimes I'm arguing for a pro-state state. Else of redistribution, of regulation, of like not having arsenic and lead in my water, that would be great. I would love that, you know. But at the same time, thinking about that the role of the state is also to manage capitalism, and capitalism is the very thing that we need to abolish in order to abolish all these other things and create a new world. So I feel like I go back and forth. I feel like Stuart Hall, I really appreciated your provocation that we should focus on this conjuncture, right? And I think going back to Stuart Hall's kind of theorizations of the state, that it is, we have to think of it as both and we also have to be able to handle thinking through contradiction on ourselves. So it's like, he talks about the welfare state as both the state that, even in the state that is giving you things, giving you resources by which to live, it's also the state that snoops and spies on you and makes sure that you're a good, deserving subject of welfare, of its welfare. But at the same time, people actually fought for these things. They fought for housing. They fought for like a ground floor. And so they weren't so much asking the state to give them things for free as they were making demands of the state for things that they were owed. And I think that your other question about how do we think of migration and mobility through the lens of debt and indebtedness and reparations, right? That the global north owes a debt to the global south, where instead of just complaining about migrants, like we actually need to create a different kind of global economic system where people have the resources that they need wherever they are located, right? That they don't actually have to abandon and leave everything that the places where they've grown up and all their communities and everything just to survive. That should not be the way the world is. And I think maybe thinking through reparations might be a different way of framing these questions. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you. Asla, you look like you have something to say.
First of all, I think, thank you so much, Paula. I do not envy you for this task of but you did a great, I think, intervention in bringing us in dialogue with one another. And I think there are three things I want to say. And I thank Miriam for updating my bio. And so in the book project, one of the key questions I had grappled with in Humanism in Ruins was the idea of bringing a critique to liberalism from the angle of the management of difference. So where I took the Greek-Turkish population exchange, Muslims exchange with Christians in 1923, as an underlying logic that keeps being reproduced, not just a particular that is something specific to Turkey, but as a structural problem that keeps being reproduced. Whenever issues at stake come to like for example in the aftermath of the Second World War with the partition of India, Palestine, the deportation of Arab Jews to Israel, this whole notion of generating and also after the Second World War in the context of Europe, getting rid of the minorities. They were seen as a threat against stability. So I think that there is one way to look at this in relation to states, and that is the notion of stability, and how the management of difference is a spatial redistribution of different categories of peoples in certain places and diluting their numbers. And what we see after the Second World War is this logic of extermination does not disappear, but it gets replaced with now you don't need to massacre them, you can just deport them. Right. You don't need to, and it becomes systematized. It's not that, of course, it didn't exist before. Of course, it did, but it becomes systematized. And then what you see is like you don't need to no longer boost birth rates, or it takes too long of certain groups, of desired groups, but basically import people that you want to populate in the right category. And so I think that what I see now is this notion being reproduced in the contemporary conjuncture, I'm going to use that word, in relation to, for example, you see white nationalists, and I want to call them white fascists in Europe, pushback coming to Greece, pushing back boats of migrants back to the sea. Those who survive back to the sea, sending them back to basically to their death, right? If they survive, it will be interesting in terms of the number of people who have died in this process. So what I really think is that that's one component of this idea of walls, apartheids, segregation, population transfers, population exchanges, all part of the same kind of logic, which becomes more pronounced today in the face of contemporary world context, because economy is not going the way it's after the big crises. Well, actually, capitalism is doing what it was supposed to be doing. The problem is, in order now to protect these privileges, more and more securitarian, like money is poured into securitarianism, and more racialization is coming into place. I think that there is this, interaction with, or maybe not interaction, but this dynamic that I am wary of. So when I'm looking at the second thing is when we look at these different sanctuary movements, different movements, in order to puncture maybe the regular, functionings of engagements with ICE and others, it's I think very important to also see the counter movements that are simultaneously bringing the pushback. So I'm not studying them because I am pessimistic, but I think I am always drawn to these things because I am trying to see how they mobilize, what kinds of issues that they bring up in relation to what state officials in different contexts. So I think I will leave it at that because I was going to make another point, but I think I spoke too long, so I'm gonna.
No, maybe we might have another. Leopold.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paula. I'm trying to pick up a few things that you also put on the table. I think for me, maybe it might be important to talk about internationalism as we kind of start doing. But internationalism has this thing is like that it's a hyper specific. It's really respectful of the specificity of each situation, which I love. And so we can talk about global north and global south, but actually we're sort of erasing the importance of specificity when we do so.
Right.
I mean, which I do often, of course. But you know, in framing the situation in the U.S., for example, is the most important thing for me seems to be to always recognize the U.S. as a settler colony, and therefore to see and to also see people who are migrating from Central America as indigenous people who are sort of practicing the land that is theirs, essentially.
Right.
When it comes to Europe, when I talk about a colonial continuum, in particular when it comes to France, in that I mean that there's the very notion of immigration makes no sense. I mean, it makes as much sense as for me moving from my small town to Paris or something like that, including in independent countries because of the stronghold that France still has on many countries, in particular in West Africa. But still, it's still in many colonies as well, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific. When it comes to Turkey, then you know, we can talk about the sort of fantasization of a new Ottoman Empire, but with a very sort of Turk supremacist kind of vision, and in the case of what you were describing, Asli, also an incredibly cynical, horrible economization of life, because migrant is currency for Erdogan. So it's the fact of closing the border on the European side is very much to be able to negotiate pretty much whatever Erdogan wants with Europe. And we can continue like that. I mean, for India as well, for Ilam, for Palestine, of course. But I think that's the importance of internationalism, is to very much always look at the specificity of each struggle, and not sort of erase it with like very general, very big general categorization of people, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
I wonder if we should bring Nasser in, Nasser, because should we bring you in to?
I'm happy to. I mean,
Yeah.
if you want to go for now, there's one question in the chat. I know Muna Zainuddin has had her hand up for a while. Do we want to go to question?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, because
yeah.
our event ends at 2, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like
okay.
I should, in a
ask,
democratic spirit, we should have more questions.
I don't know if Muna is still with us, but if they want to ask their question, now would be the time. Okay, there is also a question by Lee Barrett.
I'm very sorry, my hand was up accidentally. I didn't notice that until you said my name. Very sorry about that.
That's fine. Lee, do you want to pose your question? Please.
Lee seems to have put their question into the chat, Nasser, if you wanted to.
Okay, I'm also unmuted. I can read it aloud.
Great.
Thank you for unmuting me, and thank you for this to the speakers for your remarks. This is all really provocative and stimulates a lot of thoughts for me. And my question was related to Paula's provocation regarding liberal humanism. And I wanted to see if y'all could speak about the examples where governments appropriate grassroots movements, goals, or discourse. And so the example I'm thinking of, and Dr. Paik has written about this in a paper, it was a great paper. I'm thinking about how in the US, Democratic politicians and city governments self-designate themselves as sanctuary cities. And this designation has little resemblance to the actual grassroots anti-police movements of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s and the new sanctuary movements as it's happening in cities today. These are often non-cooperation agreements with federal immigration authorities that in fact enhance local police power. And I'm curious if y'all see comparable examples of this in other nation state contexts, if that's Turkey or France, where the discourse and goals of a grassroots movement that has this larger project of maybe abolition or dismantling police or the institutions of borders and the police gets appropriated and redeployed in a watered down version. What you think about that more broadly, as I see it as a phenomenon that happens after uprisings, where governments say like, well, we hear you and here's what we're going to do in response. But it's always a watered down or version of those goals, or in fact enhances state power. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Can I, sorry, before you all jump in, can I suggest we take another question just in the interest of time? Utitofon has their hand up. If you can unmute them and they can pose their question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for a very inspiring and provocative presentation. So my field of research is in Nigeria, West Africa, African literature, etc. And in listening to your presentations, I keep thinking back to the forms of revolution, uprising that have recently been active within the Nigerian political imaginary. So for example, we have the NSAS movement that happened in last year. And the idea of the transient nature of this movement takes on a different nuance back in Nigeria, for example, because one of the presenters was talking about, the view of the afterlives of uprising as luxury. In this social context where crisis is almost an index of everyday life, it becomes such a luxurious thing to even think of revolution because people are too occupied with everyday survival. So I'm wondering, how would we think about, the afterlives of uprising within such contexts where even if the uprisings happen, they are very transient because everybody has to go back to figuring out how to survive the crisis that is every day. And then another part of my question, I'm wondering if it's possible to think about how different forms of popular culture, and I would mean music, social media, etc., how they are serving as echo chambers that kind of collate these instances so that they exist in the collective imaginary and serve as a holding ground, as it were, that enable people, to revisit this brief moment of uprising and then serve as a means of perpetuating them. So that's what I'm wondering about, how to think of uprising in the context of the survival as crisis in the everyday and the role that popular culture has to maybe extend these afterlives a little bit further. Thank you.
I think we could turn it back to you all now.
Aslar or Naomi, do you maybe start with Lee's question? Naomi, I think maybe that one was directed to you, but anyone can answer either.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lee, I think you're exactly right that in the aftermath of uprising, we always have to be super attentive to how those demands of the uprising are absorbed and disciplined and controlled by existing powers that are actually, the demand is to overthrow those existing powers. And when those existing powers then absorb it, discipline it, and turn it into something else. So this is like, I saw Craig Gilmore on Twitter called it faux-abolition, right? So like the $5 million Mellon grant that went to Columbia, which is not for abolition, under the flag of abolition, but is actually about police reform, would be one instance of that. I think some of the Biden absorption of some of the demands of the people, of the very people who got him into office, we're gonna see more of that. We're already seeing it under immigration, asylum, detention, like all of that. It's all the same shit, but it's like under this Biden kind of liberal, vacuous liberalism, right? And so, I think that always looking like to where the movements actually came from, right? And the people who are actually mobilizing those movements, they are the ones that we should be following. And it's their original critiques that we need to be using in order to disrupt and delegitimize that kind of absorption and disciplining and control, right? I'm sure I saw your background image. I'm sure NYU is doing stuff around, our cops are not warrior cops, they're friendly cops, they're here to serve you, blah, blah, blah. That's what's happening at the Cops Off Campus Coalition nationally. So, I mean, I think all of these things, we need to just delegitimize those kinds of efforts from the jump relentlessly, because otherwise they're going to turn what we are thinking of in terms of revolution or abolition into something that is the very antithesis of those original demands. But I think your question was more about other examples elsewhere. So I think Leopold and Asa might have more to say.
Also, since we only have a few more minutes, we should also get to Utitofon's really interesting question as well. So Asla, Leopold.
Okay, so I think, thank you all for these great questions. I think we should remember that these kinds of borrowings happen all the time. And we should also remember that liberalism was never about, as Naomi was talking about. And so that was the thing that I left out, that in my previous comments were incomplete. So I'm going to bring it back and tie it together. Basically, it was always about having its own codes, its own exclusionary logics. And what it did, how liberalism throughout the 20th century, the way in which it operated in the management of difference was through domesticating demands, bringing recognition to a certain degree, but without really resolving the questions. And depth is an excellent way of actually looking at how these inequalities are being crystallized without necessarily addressing issues beyond recognition. The issue of peace, for example, that was like another liberal concept, very important concept. And it also is like coming with its own actual terms. How much did in South Africa the non-white population have to give up for peace, social peace, as opposed to the white people? There is always this asymmetry and discrepancy. So I think that any form of humanism needs to look at the limitations and limits of any terrain and any field in a way that crystallizes the inconsistencies and anxieties embedded in that terrain. That said, I think that the other question about the afterlives is an excellent one, because it's something an afterlife when it is finished. Does it have an afterlife when it is over? Or does it, and this is, I think, what also the prompt was asking us to think with. And I have been thinking about it, but I don't have an actual answer, but it is a very good question, because it is almost like when you're struggling and the struggle is constantly going, with whom and with which groups do you identify yourselves? And is, for example, these forms of like uprisings, did they really end if the struggle continues and it's getting hard, like facing more hardened state response, securitarian response? So I think that's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have an exact answer for it, but it is something really worthy thinking about. And in terms of popular culture, just very quickly, I think that what was happening in the case, at least of Turkey, in the beginnings of 2013 was many people protesting, state officials saying this is ruining our brand image. You have to, that we need stability for the economy to do well. So there was like all of these things happening where actually stability, repression becomes a simulacra for stability. And what it did was people resorting to humor. And there is a wonderful dissertation that has been written by Sinan Göknur, who actually talks about humor as a way of puncturing the exception that that these uprisings have generated in such authoritarian circumstances. So I just wanted to leave it at that, and thank you all for your questions. That's it.
Leopold, did you want to have a?
Perhaps just a little bit, yeah. I mean, answering to Lee first, I think it's interesting because I feel this is a question that perhaps would not have crossed your mind a year ago, and so similarly, I can't remember when was the last time that I sort of witnessed that in France. So I don't really, yeah. I mean, I can sort of relate it to the early 80s when the anti-racist movement, in particular the Maghrebi led but not exclusively movement, drove the sort of the first so-called socialist government to take like measures and to invent that thing called SOS racism, which is basically the Socialist Party organ against racism, but that is the same kind of people right now who are accusing us of being anti-white racist or all this kind of bullshit. So we can see how it's when it happens, it can keep on for years in like moralizing something like racism instead of systematizing it. And then just answering quickly to Titofan, I think I think your second question is sort of a good answer to your first question, which is that I feel that pop culture or art or pretty much or intellectuals rather than like being too caught up with the idea of like, oh my God, we're so privileged, we're not really the one, we're just trying to survive or anything, is just what are our role in the uprising. And in the case of NSARS, I think the diaspora played that role as well. Sometimes a bit too much, but quite often in a very in a really great way. And so some of that role is to sometimes to have the time to envision better futures and the means to get there. And I think perhaps that's where we can go back to Naomi quoting Ruth Wilson Gilmore and always her great punchlines that makes us think so much for years.
Yeah, and I have to say, Leopold, you mentioned in our discussion internally the Harsha Walia's new book, Border Rule, which I think makes many, ties many of these threads together. And I think one thing her book does is really emphasize the role of migrants themselves in imagining and enacting emancipatory politics, which I think is something that is really crucial to the kinds of ways that we're imagining a future. So I think that text, which is I think being widely read by both activists and scholars, might be a hopeful sign of things to come, at least in terms of the way we think about these things.
Well, thank you all. This has been incredibly enriching and generative. And sadly, we are at time. And we are going to wrap up the sort of formal aspect of this now. I want to thank you all, and I want to thank everyone who's come to this and all of the other sessions. It's been really wonderful to have people come back and return and to be part of this larger conversation. And I really hope in the fall and in the spring next year, we can get back to some of this, hopefully in person.